Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Joan. Good evening. My name is John Miko. I'm the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's public affairs program. As you all know, the Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia, and our fiscal and our program year runs from July to June. So this is our final program for the 2021-2022 year. This is the 37th lecture or online program that we presented, along with $400 and some thousand in scholarship aid, 220 some Good Citizen Day recipients. We have commissioned 2 major works of art, our Frederick Douglass painting in September. We have another one on the way, our wonderful archival program, our exhibits. All of what we do is made possible through generous support from members. Without that support, we cannot do anything. We cannot achieve our mission of creating better citizen leaders. So I thank you, and I also mentioned that there are a few days left in our fiscal year. So if you're not one of those that have supported us, please support our work. It is more important today than ever. A few housekeeping items. I'd ask you to please silence your cell phones. Our program will run about an hour, and we will have Q&A. We will do the Q&A through cards, which you should all have a card on your seat. During the program, our staff will come around and collect them. We'll get to as many questions as we can. We have a wonderful program summer coming up, including programs at our satellite properties. On July 12th, we're having a World War I Spy Master program at Liberty Hill with Professor Jack Devine. On the 26th of July, a Civil War Roundtable at Toursdale, which will be Philadelphia in the Civil War, which will be presented by the curator of our next exhibit, Paul Kahan, on the same subject, Philadelphia in the Civil War. And on the 15th of August at UL National, the program's Close to the Shore, the Shark Attacks of 1916. So come to the shore and never go in the water again. So the Legacy Foundation was created through the consolidation of 3 nonprofit charities, Youth Work Scholarship and Abraham Lincoln Foundation. And many people made that possible. First and foremost, though, is the first chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Joan Carter. And Joan Carter, she lives her life as she says she will, and she expects others too. And one of the things she believes strongly in is term limits, whether it be in Harrisburg, in Washington, D.C., or here at the Union League of Philadelphia. So she has termed herself out of being chair of the Legacy Foundation. Without her leadership, we would not be here today without any question. So for the final time as chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation, it is my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce to you Joan Carter. Joan.
Thank you very much. Just in case you think the whole thing is just going to fall the hell apart, I'd like to introduce my successor, who's going to be fabulous, and that is Jim Dunnigan. Mr. Dunnigan. So it is really a pleasure to introduce tonight's program. As you know, this is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. Our discussion host is a fellow league member, Charles Mitchell, and Charles is the president and CEO of the Commonwealth Foundation. I don't know if you're familiar with Commonwealth, but my husband, John Aguilera, and I personally support them. We think they do amazing work. The whole idea is to turn ideas into actionable policies. And they've done a great job of that. And Charles, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, but they had a recent win like a couple of days ago. And that was that the Pennsylvania legislature passed lifeline scholarships, which is the ability for not the people in this room, but if we don't like our public schools, we can put our kids in private schools. A lot of people can't do that. And Lifeline scholarships, that's what that's for, is to help those people get out of underperforming public schools. So our guest tonight is Betsy DeVos. Before she, yes. So before she was tapped to serve as Secretary of Education, she had already been involved in this space and established herself as one of the most influential advocates for education reform. She's been involved in free speech on campus, charter schools, school choice, and she has been unflinching in standing up to the vested interests who they have a benefit from keeping things in the status quo. She believes that educational decisions should be done as locally as possible, and there is no unit more local than the family, and that she believes that bigger is not necessarily better. And I have a quote here, government has never made anything better or cheaper, more effective or more efficient. I mean, is that music to your ears? So, and in her new book, Hostages No More, she talks about a lot of things. She talks about working in the Trump administration. She talks about the battles that she has fought to put students first. She hits back on woke, which is infecting our public schools, and details the reforms that America absolutely must pursue to fix its broken educational system. So please join me in welcoming Charles Mitchell and Secretary Betsy DeVos.
Well, good evening, fellow league members. Thank you, Joan. You described the work that I do as a human rights activist very well. Thank you. And you can understand, based on what Joan said, why I consider it one of the honors of my life to be able to interview one of my role models here with you tonight. What a joy. Now, Betsy, let's get right into it. Okay. I read this. You guys are getting this for tonight. This came out yesterday, Betsy's book, and you made a confession in here, Betsy. You said you never intended to write a book and you don't like talking about yourself. Now, that's a good indication about your character. We're glad to hear that here at the Union League. But the first question is, okay, why did you write this book if you didn't really aspire to do that? And Joan read the title, Hostages No More. Who are these hostages?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much, Charles, for doing this with me tonight, and Joan and John for the hospitality and for welcoming my husband, Dick, who's here in the front row. It's really a privilege and an honor to be with you tonight. I would not have written a book had it not been for the last 2 years, which I think has laid bare to many families and many other individuals across our country the failings of a system that I have long seen, we have long seen, and I believe it's an opportune time to change policy as a result. And I know we'll get into that more, but because of that, I really felt compelled to write about how I think we need to fix American education. And the title "Hostages No More" is provocative, and it was meant to be, but it's actually a reference to a quote that Horace Mann made, commonly known as the father of our K-12 education system, a quote that he made, which was that Educators are entitled to look upon parents as having given hostages to our cause. And it's been pretty clear the last 2 years to a lot of families that their children have been held hostage in many different ways. And whether it was the extended lockdowns, the mask mandates, the distance learning that wasn't, the curriculums that they found a front row seat to in their living rooms or kitchens that they found appalling, or on the other hand, entirely unimpressive and not robust. Any number of those, any combination of those things has really awakened families that never before considered the state of our K-12 system the most undisrupted industry in our country.
Well said. Now, we're going to talk more about that industry, but just for one more minute, Betsy, I'm going to try to get you to do the thing you really don't want to do, which is to talk about yourself. I really do recommend the book because there's bits and pieces about Betsy's background that you never heard from the mainstream media. And one of those things is we've all seen the all iconic art of Rosie the Riveter. You guys remember? Well, tonight, I learned from the book, we have with us Betsy the Riveter. You were a riveter way back when. Can you tell us the story of how did that happen?
I was. So I was fortunate to grow up in a home with a very entrepreneurial set of parents. And my father started a business when I was about 7 years old. He thought he could do better what he had been doing for another business for some time. And so he started with building die-cast machinery, but that quickly morphed into, in addition to die-cast machinery, a very capital-intensive product for sales. He developed the lighted sun visor. So any of you who've enjoyed the lighted sun visors in your vehicles, started with my dad.
Wait, the government didn't invent it, Betsy?
The government did not invent it.
It was an entrepreneur and he
It
happened
was
to be
an
your father.
entrepreneur, yes. And I had the privilege of being on the end of the production line the first summer when I was, the first summer that we produced them, I was in middle school or junior high as we called it then. And I inspected, packed, and shipped all of the sun visors that summer. So imagine my age, you can imagine how few visors there were that first summer. But roll forward a few years and it was expected that I was going to work in the summers. And so I chose to work the third shift in the visor plant. And naturally, being the boss's daughter, I got the worst job on the line. And that was taking the plastic core of the sun visor off the injection molding machine, putting a bunch of rubber edge banding around it, a metal plate in the corner. I could still do it in my sleep, folding it over and then riveting this core of the sun visor about 9 different places. And the fact that I never riveted my hands during that summer, the third shift, where it was a little drowsy on more than one occasion, was amazing.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
I love it. Now, let's talk about these hostages for a minute, okay? The students who you are defending in this book and who you've defended in your work for, what is it, 35 years now?
That's right.
They're being hurt, they're being harmed. And I think for a lot of people, our eyes have opened maybe over the last 2 years with the COVID shutdowns, especially in a city like Philadelphia.
Yeah.
You know, there's been massive learning loss over the last 2 years.
Exactly.
But one of the most interesting facts in your book is you say, we were starting to experience that learning loss in America even before COVID. So before we'll get into solutions, right? But I think it would be great if maybe you'd paint a picture for our audience of just how bad the problem is out there in terms of learning loss, in terms of what's going on in our undisrupted system. And I know it's that severity of the problem that has driven you into the fight to fix it.
Yeah, so just to roll back a little bit, the Department of Education was founded in 1979 as a political payoff to the teachers' unions by Jimmy Carter, who earned their endorsement the first time they endorsed a presidential candidate. That was the foundation or formation of the Department of Education. And now, more than $1 trillion later at the federal level, the express goal of forming the department was to close the achievement gaps. Well, the most recent NAEP data before the pandemic demonstrated that not only have we not narrowed the achievement gaps one little bit, they've actually widened by many measures. And in fact, those at the top end of the performance scale have plateaued off, and those at the bottom have really plummeted. And so even before the pandemic, before the shutdowns, before the learning losses, we've had dismal results, and we've been continuing to pay more and more money for them. When you look at us as compared to our international competitors and peers, we aren't in the top 10 by any measure. We are 13th in reading, 18th in science, and 37th in math. Now, I don't know about any of you, but I think if we were pulling those kind of scores as Olympians, I don't think we would stand for it as a nation. So we cannot stand for it with our most valuable assets, our children. They represent 100% of our future.
So let's talk about what we do about that, okay? That's the problem. You have a term here, education freedom, and I'm going to read for everybody, since they could only get the book tonight, the way you define that term. You say education freedom is the ability for a family to choose when, where, and how their child is educated. So that's your solution to that problem. Now, let's be fair-minded for a minute, right? Some might say there's better solutions, more money, right? That's what our governor right now, who you dealt with when you were education secretary, we'll talk about that. Right now, he's saying here in Pennsylvania, the way to improve those problems is another $1.5 billion, right? Some people over the last 2 years have said the key is we just got to get the schools reopened. I liked the school my kid went to. We just got to get them back open again, right? And some people, especially some people who might be in this room tonight, might say, well, we have to ban certain ideas in education. We need to ban critical race theory or whatever. But you say that the prescription isn't any of those things. It's education freedom. Why is that the best solution?
Well, it's the best solution because the family is the first educator of children. And much of the family's agency has been taken away in the last number of decades and taken over, frankly, by a system that is not serving way too many of them very well at all, and as has been revealed to even more the last 2 years. And I use the word education freedom as opposed to school choice, which I used for many years, as you know, many of us have, because I think school choice gives us a limiting view of what education freedom can actually be. I picture buildings, I picture systems, I picture what we know more than what can be. And I think when we talk about education freedom, we can think much more broadly about what education and learning can actually look like, acknowledging that kids are different. They all learn differently. And I bet if I ask for a show of hands in this room, about how many of you may have been bored at more than one point during your K-12 years, there'd be a pretty hefty percentage of you. But that's not what learning and education should be. It should be engaging. It should be exciting. It should make you curious to do the next thing or learn the next thing. But there's very little about our K-12 system, now 175 plus years old, that really engages all kids in that way. Certainly some, and for those for whom their assigned school or their chosen school is working, that's great. They would not have to go anywhere else. But for those for whom it is not working, we need to have a lot of other options. And if we facilitate the ability for all families with children to make those choices for their children, we're going to have a much bigger marketplace that is ultimately going to result in a lot more providers with a lot more creativity and ingenuity applied to that. And in a very short period of time, I think we see a totally different result because kids will go to places and be in places that they actually are engaged with their learning.
So there's another quote I want to read from your book, but you just caused me to pause for a second because you and I have something in common. You mentioned that guy in the front row. You seem to be a fan of his, your husband. My greatest regret about tonight is My wife can't be here because my wife and your husband have something in common. We're both married to people who started schools.
Exactly.
So my wife started a very non-traditional, it's not even really a school, it's a learning environment like what you've described, where the focus is on joyful learning. And I so wish she could be here to hear this because she's doing what you talk about. But let's embarrass your spouse since we can't embarrass mine. Just as an example for everybody of what you mean when you say, think so much bigger about what education can be. Could you maybe say a little bit about Dick's school? It's a little bit
Sure.
non-traditional, isn't it?
Yes, it
Embarrass him a
is.
little bit, right? You know?
I will. I don't think he'll be embarrassed. I think he'll actually smile. But Dick started about 11 years ago a charter high school. So it is traditional in the sense that it is a publicly funded school that has to live within the regulations of Michigan's charter school law. So it does have that, to deal with, but that's the reality in Michigan right
Sure.
now. But his charter school is a high school that is focused on aviation. And that's the convening theme for the school. Now, Dick happens to be an aviator, a very good one at that. He flew me here today. So kudos to him. But it is drawing kids, and they've capped the number off for students in 9th through 12th grade at 600 students, because that's a good size. It's not too big, it's big enough. And of course, they've got waiting lists for every grade now. But all of the convening idea is aviation. And so you have kids that are involved with building an airplane from scratch. You have high school seniors who, when they graduate, there's a couple of dozen from the graduating class that have earned their private pilot's license. You also have a biomedical engineering program that's taken root there. And there was just an amazing little piece on our local television about how these students, for their learning project, designed a contraption that took this little boy in a wheelchair who has no use of his legs, and he can get himself onto this little caddy thing. I don't know what you call it, but he can motate around with the touch of a button. And these kids designed it and built it for him for this purpose and for under $100. And now this little boy has, ability to roll himself anywhere he wants to. And these kids have had a marvelous learning experience. So all that to say, it's a different convening idea. And it draws from 7 counties in West Michigan. Families are driving from long distances to have their kids come to this aviation high school. And it's just a great and joyful spot.
Imagine that. It's not just sitting in a chair getting bored.
Right.
And I mean, I don't know how many aviators there are in the room. I know some aviators. I've never met a poor one. And I know some pilots, and I've never met a poor pilot. Because if you can get into the aviation business, you have clients and you have a good living, right?
Right. And well, we all know that we need a whole lot more people involved in aviation
Bingo.
today, right?
Bingo. I mean, so but that's
Yeah.
what we're talking about with non-traditional education. Yes, it's a charter, but it's a very non-traditional focus. Just one example. Now, Betsy, I said I wanted to read one other bit from your book. I'm going to read some other people's words later, but these are your words. This is what you write about our education system, and I want everybody in the room to hear it. In this country, which here at the Union League we love, we believe that it doesn't matter who your parents are. We all have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But when it comes to education in America, it very much matters who your parents are. Parents who can afford to find the right schools for their children do so, either by moving to a suburb with good public schools or paying for private education. Parents who can't afford to send their kids anywhere other than where their local school assigns them, well, they have to do what they're told and hope for the best. And here's the punchline. Betsy says, that system, she says, it's very un-American. Those are strong words. What I take away from those words is, one, you're serious when you talk about how messed up our system is, but to me, even more importantly, your greatest concern, as I read you, is the most vulnerable children whose parents can't afford a great school. Is that what you're all about?
Absolutely. I mean, it's who I've been advocating for 35 years. And all of the policy work that's been done really has been with the focus on those families that have the least access to those choices and opportunities. And yeah, that even though that has not been the portrayal,
Yeah.
that has been the work.
Yeah.
And that's been consistent.
Well, I think it's important for this group to hear that. They've been told things about you,
Yeah.
but I want you to have the opportunity to tell them what's in your heart.
Well, and the reason I first got involved with education at all started when our oldest son, Rick, was going to start kindergarten. And Dick and I knew we were going to be able to have our children go to school wherever we thought was best for them. And so I was looking around West Michigan, trying to find the best location for him. He'd gone to a Montessori preschool for a couple of years and loved it, loved that approach and that environment. And I was trying to find something, similar going into grade school. I didn't find that, but what I did find was a really great little Christian school in the heart of our city that was serving kids in that neighborhood. And I got involved with that school. And as soon as I did as a volunteer, I began to realize that for every child there and every family represented, there were probably 10 or 20 other families in that neighborhood, in that area, that would have loved to have their children in that school and couldn't. They couldn't afford the tuition. The families there couldn't afford the tuition. The founders of the school had to raise 90% of the operating funds every year. And so I got involved. Dick and I started getting involved with giving scholarships to students in West Michigan, supporting kids at that school. Long story short, it became clear in a matter of a few years that just advocating through 501c3 efforts to change policy was not going to happen. And so that led me into advocacy via political means. And I was already well versed in the politics of things, having served in every role in the Michigan Republican Party. And so I started getting involved on the political side, which I recount in some detail in the book.
Yes, you do. So let's talk about the politics for a minute. We talked about the high aspiration, and I think it's beautiful. We also know it doesn't happen fast enough. And you're very pointed, and I think in Philadelphia, that's a compliment, just so you know. I don't know about West Michigan, but here we like it. So you're very
Well,
pointed.
we call it West Michigan nice, and sometimes I'm not very West Michigan nice.
I think we like her, huh, Philadelphia? All right, but you're very straight on in the book, Betsy, about the obstacle that stands in the way. And the biggest obstacle, I think, is not obvious to everyone who shares your vision of education freedom. You name them. It's the school unions.
Yes.
Can you just flesh out, I know it's obvious to you, but can you just flesh out for a little bit why it is that they're really the bullies standing in the schoolhouse door,
Right.
keeping kids in violent, failing schools? Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Sure. So the school unions, there's two major ones, national ones, and then they have all their allied organizations. And I had to deal with all of them while in Washington. I commonly or affectionately referred to it as the blob or the alphabet soup of acronyms. But they're all allied with the same mission of protecting and enhancing this system that really holds students and holds children in these districts, in these schools, whether they're the right fit for them or not, whether their parents want them there or not. And they do so by really making sure that they have almost complete control of one party. And when you think about it, taxpayers pay the bills for education. So taxpayers are paying the salaries for all of the school union staff that then has dues extracted from their paychecks to fund the union activities that then go around into the campaign accounts of the individuals who then pledge their allegiance to continuing to support and defend and expand this particular status quo blob. And it's become a very vicious cycle that has benefited those organizations and those involved with them, but it's been at the great expense of millions of kids.
Yes. And you experienced that personally in a variety of ways. There's one in particular I think will be educational to our group here. I noticed that just months before you were appointed as Secretary of Education, which, by the way, I'd just like to say was the best day of the Trump administration from my perspective, a certain, thanks. A certain United States senator gave a speech at an event for the American Federation for Children, which you chaired, where he called education freedom, this is a direct quote, the last battle of the civil rights movement. Less than a year later, this individual voted against your nomination as Secretary of Education, and this is another exact quote. He said, "You have been silent on the issues that are so critical to this country being who we say we are." Now, Betsy, I want to ask you, and I just want to tell you why I'm going to ask you. It's not because we want to go criticize people. It's because I think our audience needs to understand what this battle really is like and how people who say things like this is the civil rights issue of our time, because of those powerful special interests that you talk about, so often turn tail and turn their backs. I mean, ultimately, you'll be okay. He turned his back on you, but he turned his back on kids.
Yeah.
Who was that United States senator? And is that indicative of what you've seen from people who should be supporting kids in elective office and don't?
Well, his name is Cory Booker, and he was a very good friend and ally for many, many years. And so it was very, it was very hurtful and disheartening, not for me as much personally. It was somewhat personally, but for the kids that he was turning his back on. And he even acknowledged how he had aspirations for the presidential race at that point. And he even acknowledged where the teachers union had, it's a quote that I probably won't get it exactly right, but basically they took me into the broom closet and made me change my mind. And so it was very disheartening. And, I just hope and pray that he comes back around again and that he actually helps to buck the trend in the Democrat Party that is so closely allied with and pays homage to this system that is continually supported.
And he's not the first one. Betsy also cites in her book Senator Elizabeth Warren, who wrote her own book, not very well, it was a couple decades ago, where she endorsed education
Where she actually
freedom,
called for
school vouchers.
Mhm.
No more,
Mhm.
right? So we've seen that unfortunately many times where people respond to those incentives in politics. Betsy, if we can, I do want to put the spotlight back on you, but I want to take it off you for a second and talk about here in Philadelphia and here in Pennsylvania. You're very familiar with the education issues here in Pennsylvania from your time as secretary, from your work with AFC. I think you know, I don't think everybody else in the room knows that we have someone here in the room tonight who has stood against what you're talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard this Lifeline scholarship bill earlier that Joan talked about that would do exactly what we're here to talk about, right? Which would allow the most vulnerable children to access a great education. And it's got a couple more hurdles that we got to get over. But as of now, and one of those hurdles is our governor, don't get me started. But as of now, there's one person in our state who has stood above everyone in his advocacy for this, Betsy. And I think you had the opportunity to shake his hand earlier, and I think we should acknowledge that he's here tonight. And that is a state representative, a Democrat here from Philadelphia who sponsored this bill, and that's State Representative Amen Brown. Representative, thank you.
Yes.
Now, Betsy, he got a primary for that,
I know.
and he won.
I know. Yes. Yeah.
That's what we're talking about, right?
Right.
Now, enough about Cory Booker. Here in Pennsylvania, we know New Jersey is kind of a second-class state anyway. Amen? We're better, all right? So let's talk about Pennsylvania for a minute. When you were secretary, you became very familiar with our governor. He ran for office saying he wanted to zero out our school choice scholarship program. Instead, working with you, Commonwealth Foundation, great elected officials in the legislature like Representative Brown, we've tripled that program over his 7 years, which is great. And there's so much more to do. The Lifeline Scholarship is an example. Based on all that, I have to say there's one photo in your book that was the most meaningful to me. I love tripling scholarship programs. I love beating the bad guys. But at the end of the day, for me, it's all about kids. And there's a photo in your book of a number of young people. One of them is Samuel Myers from Ohio, who you talk about in your book. Another one is Miles Slade Bowers, who we helped get a scholarship here in Pennsylvania. And they had the opportunity to look the President of the United States in the eye and tell him what school choice, what education freedom, what these scholarships meant to them. My impression from reading your book is you didn't, well, first of all, it's not an impression. You didn't seek this job. Governor Jeb Bush said, will you do it? And you were shocked and you agreed to do it. My sense is you agreed to do it because you wanted the bully pulpit, not for you, but for these kids, for education freedom. What was it like for you when you got those opportunities, whether it was with Miles, whether it was with Samuel, whether it was, we could talk about Janiyah here from Philadelphia, right? What was it like for you to be able to give them that bully pulpit and that opportunity to speak?
Oh, it was such a thrill. I mean, you referenced that meeting in the cabinet room with the president and those, filled with young people who had directly benefited from education freedom programs, and to hear from them directly and talking to the president about what it meant to them personally. There's nothing more touching and more convicting than hearing from those young people. And I had the opportunity to be with a number of them last night, the American Federation for Children Fellows, and Miles was there. So saw Miles and talked with him for a bit. But they are the best ambassadors for why we need to have education freedom, because it's affected them personally, impacted them personally. And I'll never forget, Samuel Myers had written out his whole letter about what he wanted to do in the future. And President Trump asked him, and he shared that. And it was one of the most touching moments. And of course, during this, all of the media, and if you haven't been in the cabinet room, let me just say, it's not as big as it looks on TV. It's not a big room. And the media crushes in there, and they were literally hanging over the table with their boom mics over the top of Samuel. And he just bravely read his letter to everyone there. And it was just a beautiful moment. And it's moments like that that really keep me going and convicted to keep fighting harder and longer.
That's awesome. I could ask a million more questions. I'm going to control myself and ask you only one more. But before I do it, I'm going to exercise the privilege and just tell a quick story. The Union League members that are here know that there's a lot of things in this building named for the Templetons, who were friends of yours. And as I listen to that story, Betsy, I'm reminded of a story that my colleague Matt Briette told me once about Jack Templeton. And Jack referenced the fact that if you see a soldier in an airport, what's the common response? Thank you for your service, right? Once in some of our various conversations here about rescuing kids and fighting against teachers' unions and all of the rest of it, Jack took Matt aside. Matt now runs the largest PAC in the state, by the way, very similar to what you did in Michigan. And the number one thing it does is support those who fight for kids. And Jack said, Matt, I just want you and your colleagues to know you serve. You don't wear a uniform, but you serve. So I want to tell you, thank you for your service. Well, with that story told, after listening to that story again about the cabinet room and thinking about your service, I think on behalf of this room, I'd like to say thank you for your service.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me exercise the privilege. One more question, and then we'll take the questions from the group. If you have a question, there are cards coming around. We've talked about the problem in our country. We've talked about how education freedom is the answer. You get specific in your book. You have things that people should do. A couple examples that I remember, you talk about the institution that you started in Michigan to become active in the political sphere. If you care about this, you have to, and in the advocacy sphere. You talk about starting new schools. That runs in my family. I'm great with it.
Yes.
There's a prize that originated here in Pennsylvania called the Yoss
Mhm.
Prize to recognize those kinds of educational innovations, right? So I think it's fair to say here in Pennsylvania, we're trying to do our part. But
Absolutely.
so having said that, though, what is your advice to this audience? If they are animated, as I obviously am, by your vision, by what should be done in America, if they want to seize this incredible opportunity we have where, the cultural dynamic on this issue is very different from your ballot question in Michigan in 2000, from when Dick ran for governor in 2006, right? It's not an easy fight, but it's much different today.
Indeed.
What is your advice? What's your ask? What do you want people to do after they leave here tonight?
I would just encourage you to figure out how you can best support the efforts that are already underway. You have an effective PAC that is working hard in Pennsylvania. You have organizations that are advocating for specific policies that are going to bring education freedom. Help ensure that this piece of legislation that just was introduced actually gets passed. Lobby your state legislators and your governor, and raise your voices. It really does take a chorus to convince some people that this is an issue worthy of their political capital. And I think the arguments are easier today than they've ever been. We've, again, had laid bare for us all to see failings that weren't as evident to as many people a couple of years ago. And if you are inspired, start a school. I mean, think about ways you can provide learning opportunities in a new and fresh way for kids that need something entirely different than that one size fits all line up in a row of desks with the sage on the stage.
Wonderful.
And there's a lot more ideas, specific ideas in the book. I mean, it's really heartening to see people going to school board meetings and now paying attention to school board races. Many of them, as you well know, it's probably the same in Pennsylvania as it is in Michigan. You don't even know when the school board races take place by design. The system designs it that way because they don't really want you to know about it, because then you might participate. And now they've been found out in many places. And that is, I think, yielding some good and important results. But again, the school boards are really to support and govern a system that for too many kids just isn't the right model. So I really encourage you to look beyond and see where you can fit in and where you are energized to make that difference.
Yeah, that's great. And that's one of the things you do make clear in your book is there's a political side to this. There's a policy side to this. There's a innovation and starting new institutions side to it. And there's lots of ways to engage. Some of us like to do more than one, but you could just pick one, right? If you don't like the politics, go start a school.
Right.
Now, Betsy, there's lots of questions. So I'm going to try and move through them as fast as I can. From having read your book, I have a sense that you'll have an answer ready to this one. I don't know if you get this everywhere you go, but at the Union League, we quote the Constitution in the Q&A period. So we have the text of the 10th Amendment. Those powers not enumerated in this Constitution, ... are reserved to the states or to the people. Question with that as the prelude. Should the feds have anything to do with education?
No. There are two areas under federal law that do relate to kids in learning years. And one is civil rights laws, but they don't have to be handled by a Department of Education. The other is for students with disabilities to ensure that they have the right supports that they need. But again, that does not have to have a federal agency to ensure that happens. That can reside in one of the other myriad of agencies. I actually presented a budget that would have block granted back all of the money from the department to the states to decide how to best utilize it for their specific state. And I have been on record, and I will be on record again to say I do not think the Department of Education should exist. It is not serving students, it's serving systems, it's serving adults, it's serving organizations that have vested interest in protecting what they have and where they have it. And I think, Jimmy Carter's bargain in the 1970s was a bad one that should be acknowledged and reversed.
Maybe in your second term as education secretary, you'll just padlock the front door. That would work for me. Next question. How do we reach the children who, through no fault of their own, parents and guardians that either don't know or care, are relegated to the government schools? This questioner said, education freedom is great, but only for kids whose parents know or care. I'm sure you've had this question before.
I've
Betsy.
had this question, and I would say, first off, while there may be a very, very small percentage for whom that is the case, my experience has been over 30 plus years that parents care deeply. There's nobody who cares more about their children than parents do. They may not have the right tools to find all the right solutions right now, but that's also part of the opportunity when education freedom programs are passed to ensure that you put the implementation part in place so that families can find out, parents can find out, guardians can find out about these solutions. And I think about one of the young women who today is one of the AFC fellows, Denisha Merriweather, who found herself in a similar situation. She had an absent mother, no father in her life, and a godmother who, after Denisha was kicked out of third grade twice, said, I'm going to find something different. And she didn't know it was called the Tax Credit Scholarship Program in Florida, but she found this little school that she thought would be a better place for Denisha. And Denisha got a chance to go there through the Tax Credit Scholarship Program. She was the first in her family to graduate from high school, and she now has earned a graduate degree and is now spending her adult life advocating for these opportunities for kids too. And so I go back to the fact that families are going to find solutions. And even if you make the argument there's going to be some that don't, for the ones that don't, the kids will ultimately benefit, as we've seen in Florida, where in the districts where the most number of students are going to schools other than their assigned school, the achievement levels have gone up for those in the schools where the kids remain. And I think that's because, number one, kids have left for whom that school wasn't a fit. And number two, those school leaders are making changes and making decisions that they refused to make before because they now have something to compare themselves against. There's some, benchmarks, there's some competition that they have to actually pay attention to.
It almost reminds you of the fact that you really can't buy a car now that doesn't have a lighted visor.
Indeed.
A little bit of
Now, they've actually gone a lot cheaper on them lately, I have to say. I have not seen quite the quality of visors as they originally were, but
Unfortunately, you've
that's an
been
added
distracted
drawback.
with some other business.
Yes. And it's no longer being manufactured by my family's
Of
business.
course,
So
of course. A little bit of local context, and you have the statistic in your book of the percentage of children in Philadelphia who go to charter schools. I believe it's 25%. We also have, as you know, a lot of Catholic education in this area, a lot of rich history, some amazing schools. I think that's what lies behind this question. Is there a place for all three? Public education, Catholic education, and charter schools?
absolutely there is. And there's place for homeschools, there's place for micro schools, there's place for virtual education. There may be other methods of delivery we haven't even thought of yet, but we've been really sort of confined within this system that has said we have to do K-12 education this way. But absolutely, there's room for all of those and more.
Yep.
Mhm.
Related question. Is there a country other than the US that gets K-12 education right? If so, what aspects of their system are most critical?
Well, the system in the Netherlands is very much a choice system and supports a whole range of schools where families can choose directly where to send their children. And, you know, the Netherlands consistently has much higher results in achievement levels. I don't think there are any others that have, that would be direct comparables to what we're talking about. But then again, you know, our system has been somewhat unique as well. And so, yeah, I would just say, I think Australia has similar, but not quite as much freedom.
Yep. I would also say to the questioner, if you want more about that, Google Philadelphia Inquirer Progressive Education. There's a columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer here who happens to be a colleague of mine, the executive vice president of Commonwealth Foundation, who wrote a column about that very thing, about how many other countries are more progressive on education than we are. Why? Because they let the money follow the child. So
Well, and I would just add in there, I think about Switzerland, which has a really unique model, and I
Yeah.
had the chance to go and learn about their apprenticeship model. And I was shocked to learn that 75% of high school students are actually working in and learning
Yep.
in an apprenticeship.
Yep.
And it's a much broader concept of apprenticeship, and it's something that we need to get really serious about, I think, because there's almost no profession that you could not benefit from some kind of an apprenticeship approach. And the CEO and the president of UBS, one of the largest banks in the world, started as an apprentice in a bank. And so it gave us a different picture of what apprenticeships could be. But another, you know, really important model and opportunity to look at.
absolutely. You're speaking my language. Right before I came over here, I was with a fifth grader who just had her first apprenticeship and is beginning to learn what she wants to do when she grows
Yeah,
up.
that's so great.
You can-
My oldest granddaughter did as well this past year,
yeah, and,
also fifth grade.
yeah, and you can start to get your head around what you want to be and what you think your
Exactly.
gifts are and your callings are
Yeah.
at that age. Betsy, let's switch tracks a minute. Everything we've talked about so far tonight is K-12 education. Obviously, it's something we both care deeply about, but you did a lot of other stuff when you were secretary. So this question's about higher education. The Affordable Health Care Act had a provision to eliminate the private student loan industry. Did you advise the Trump administration to eliminate that provision? And why aren't Republicans talking about this ripoff of our young people?
No. So the whole student loan area is one we could spend a lot of time on. And, you know, when I early on learning about it coming into office, you know, I just said, this is really an untenable prospect here for the long term. The fact that that student loans were federalized in 2010 to pay for Obamacare has certainly not proven itself or even close. In fact, the way the government accounts for the student debt, you know, the value of the student debt owed to the US government, if any of us did that in the private sector, we would be in jail. And we've seen the price of higher education skyrocket since student loans were federalized in 2010. It has resulted in a myriad of problems that until we really wind back that move and acknowledge that the federal government should not have one of the largest banks in the world under the Department of Education. You know, I think there is no resolution absent really winding that back and looking at the private sector to resume student lending in a very significant way. And this notion about just forgiving student debt, number one, it's illegal. The president cannot do it. Number two, it's unfair to even consider it, given that 2 out of 3 Americans never took out student debt. And why should they pay and underwrite the debt of the students that knowingly decided to take those loans? And what about those students who faithfully repaid their student loans and the families that saved for their children's education and the veterans that earned their GI Bill? There's nothing about that is makes sense or is fair. And I mean, it's just a really bad idea, and it doesn't solve anything. So if you took away and wiped away a bunch of student debt, then what? You haven't solved anything. You're going to have students taking out more student debt next year. So the whole issue is one that Congress has to get serious about really addressing and winding back this federalization of student lending.
Yeah. That's great. So, all right, John Miko says he's about to give us the hook. So Betsy, last question. At the risk of getting you mad at me again, let's go back to your least favorite topic, which is you.
Oh, great.
I don't know if our audience knows this or not. Betsy DeVos was the first cabinet secretary in history to receive so many credible threats against her life that, Betsy, you had to be assigned security provided by the U.S. Marshals. You didn't have to go through that. You could have backed down. You could have quit. You could have said, no, thank you, Mr. President. Why didn't you?
Well, I was there to serve students and serve the American people. And I regret that I had to have that protection, but I'm grateful for it. And the men and women of the U.S. Marshal Service that protected me were wonderful people. And I am so thankful for having had them. I did regularly, I insisted on meeting quarterly with their supervisors to say, I want to review, I want to see what's actually going on here. I want to know what's happened. How am I being threatened? In what way? How often? Because I don't want to have this if it's not truly necessary.
Yeah.
And it was. And I just have to say that last night we had a little party, a celebration, because yesterday was the actual launch day of the book, but we had a little celebration in Washington, and I invited all of the marshals that had been part of the detail, and I was thrilled to see like way more than half of them came, and it was just so great to see them, and they were really wonderful, wonderful people, and I was just very grateful for what they did to let me be able to do my job.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Betsy DeVos for being with us today, and Charles Mitchell. Thank you so much. And for everyone who's interested, and I'm sure it's everyone here, we do have signed copies of the book in the back of the room. So please purchase a signed copy of the book. And God bless you, Betsy DeVos. And thank you for your service.
Thank you.